So welcome to another one of my brush licking painting videos. This time I'm showing you how to paint the tabards on the Black Templars. I've had a few people on Instagram asking how I'm doing this, so I figured it good to show you all. I'm using one of the Sternguard Veterans from the Leviathan box because they've all got great tabards. And I'm using AK grey brown, warm grey, leather brown, and a little bit of Vallejo's matte medium throughout this. So I start off from a black undercoat and I'm laying in the grey brown as a base coat. This video is sped up 3 times because you don't really need to see this in real time. I think it roughly took me about 40 minutes to paint this entire tabard, but I'm very slow. So once I've sort of blocked in the grey brown, I think it took about 4 coats, and then I'll fast forward to the end of that. So now we've finished the grey brown base coat, it's time to mix in a little bit of warm grey and start building some highlights. So I think I'm mixing in about 1 part warm grey into 2 to 3 parts grey brown, but as you can see with my wet palette, it's quite an organic process. And you can also see that I've mixed 2 variations of the tones, one which is probably slightly more favouring the grey brown, and one which is heading closer towards the warm grey. So now I've essentially got 3 different tones, pure grey brown, about 50-50 warm grey and grey brown, and then one with a bit more warm grey. So now I'm using the sort of the mid-tone and starting to build out those highlights. I've got a little bit of water in the mix, but not too much because it's such a subtle colour change from the grey brown. You don't need too much blending going on here, and we can always glaze it at a later stage. So this is roughly 50-50 grey brown to warm grey, and I'm just picking out the high points in the material, the places the light would naturally fall, the little fold above his belt, the top of the crease above his below his belt, and just generally all of the tops of the folds. It can always help to look at the model from above or from the direction of the source of light and just see what you can see which parts are facing the light, which parts are higher than others, because those are going to be the bits that are brighter. So once we've finished the grey brown warm grey 50-50 highlight stage, then we move on with a little bit more of the warm grey in the mix. It's sort of at this point 3 parts warm grey to 1 part grey brown, and again we're just picking out the high points and building up that tone and building up the brighter values on the parts that would catch the light. You'll also see that I'm putting a little bit more light towards the bottom of it. That might not catch as much light, and tonally it probably should be darker than some of the higher parts of the model at least. But just for interest and to define the edge of that tabard, I like to keep the end just a little bit brighter. So now we're working with pure warm grey in quite a dilute consistency. It's probably 2 parts water to 1 part paint. And again, because it's a little bit more of a bigger change this time from the previous layers, we want to keep it quite dilute and quite thin as a sort of glaze consistency so that you can blend it a little smoother and not have such a harsh transition. But you can see I'm barely touching the model. I'm just going for the very absolute high points and the very outside edges of the material to create that sort of 3-dimensional feel. And again, with every increasing highlight layer, we're just getting smaller and smaller and very much barely touching the absolute high points. I'm also using it just to define the little folds and just little details in the sculpt that just you want to draw the eye to. They might not be absolutely perfect as far as technical lighting and what would hit, and certainly the edge highlights that I'm doing here aren't technically perfect, but they make the model look interesting, and they highlight the folds and the creases and the edges of the sculpt, which especially from a distance or for something so small as this, you want to have as much contrast as possible, just to keep it interesting. So now I'm mixing up a thinner glaze. I think this is just grey-brown, warm grey, 50-50. I grabbed it out of somewhere in the middle of my wet palette, so I'm not exactly sure what the mix is. But by mixing about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, you create a really thin glaze consistency. And then by barely having anything on your brush, then you can just have like super thin, and you can see tiny brush strokes just gradually fading the edges of these highlights and just smoothing everything down and blending everything together. You can spend a really long time on this part of the process, depending on what level you're going for. I tend to paint my stuff to a sort of a higher gaming standard, but if you were going for a competition or something like that, then you're going to want to take a lot more time thinning and glazing and just smoothing out all of your transitions. You could pretty much leave it at this stage for gaming standard now, but I like to fiddle a little bit more, and I find painting super relaxing, so I just take a long time on each little piece. You can see I'm just blending, going over and over, and because the paint's so thin and I've got so little on my brush, each brush stroke is barely registering, and it's drying very, very quickly, so I can keep going over the same areas and just fading in and blending those little highs and just smoothing out that transition between the absolute highs and the lows. So now we've got a slightly darker mix. We're going back more towards pure grey-brown, again with a glaze, 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and again we're just smoothing, this time focusing more on the shadows and the parts where the sort of mids meet the shadows, and anywhere that we want to be a bit darker, but also just building that smoothness into the shadows. Again, because it's super thin, you can just glaze over your transitions a fair few times and just smooth things out. And now I'm going with a little bit of matte medium mixed in with the warm grey to just smooth out the and glaze the highlights. The reason I'm putting a bit of matte medium in is just because it helps the paint flow a little nicer. It increases the workability a little bit. If you think of matte medium as like an invisible paint, it basically helps the paint to go further and cover in a sort of a glaze consistency. Some paints I don't think need additional medium to work with, but I do find certain lighter paints just benefit it, especially when you get towards the end of your glazing layers and you don't want to sort of mess it up. I often mix in a bit of matte medium, and it just makes things a little smoother, a bit more workable, and just makes the finish nicer. So now by this point of the model, I'm starting to think that it's all a bit mid-tony. There's not like the dark contrast that we want, and I find the high points really need to be balanced with the sort of extreme contrast to really pop. So in this case, I've picked up some leather brown, which it's not much darker than grey brown, but it is darker. And again, that with some water, about 3-4 parts water to 1 part paint, and then a little bit of the matte medium just to help tie it all together. And here I'm just glazing in some deeper shadows into the real dark depths of the material, creating shadows underneath sort of where the armour panels meet and in the real recesses of the folds. I'm also adding in a little bit more shading around the sort of side, which is quite difficult to see on the video, but around the sides of where the armour meets the tabard, just to add interest and create separation. Naturally, there wouldn't be much light falling on that point anyway, so it makes sense. But I'm just using this leather brown as just a way to increase the contrast. So now I'm mixing up a little bit more of a glaze with that pure warm grey, and just again using it to smooth out the highs, but also just build up a little bit more high to the absolute highlights. As you go over and glaze things with different colours, it's gradually going to sort of soften but also dull the highlights. So we're just picking out the absolute edges Again, because it's a super thin glaze, it takes a few coats to build it up, but it just gives you that control and helps keep everything nice and smooth and clean. So now I'm mixing a little bit of black in with that leather brown, because I just want even more depth to some of the extreme dark areas. A little bit more matte medium just to keep things flowing smoothly. And again, a very, very unloaded brush, not much paint on it at all. And I'm just using this on the recesses, the really dark bits, and just to pick out that extra contrast. It works quite well if you can get sort of an extreme dark next to an extreme light, because that contrast just helps to really sell the effect and just draw the viewer's eyes to where you want it to go. So you can see here I'm putting a bit of that extra dark black and leather brown mix underneath, and by turning the model upside down I can sort of see the opposite direction where the strongest shadows are going to be. Anything that's pointing towards the ground is usually going to be darkest. So I'm just painting in a little bit of extra shadow into that. So that's the tabard pretty much finished. I hope this has been helpful for you all. If you've got any questions, give me a shout on Instagram or in the comments below. Please do subscribe and like and share and all of those things, because the more people that are seeing this stuff I'm putting out, then the more I'm going to put out and hopefully get better at it all. Thanks for watching.